March 1944. Deep in the Burmese jungle, 200 kilometers behind Japanese lines, Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka wrote words that would have sentenced him to execution if his superiors discovered them. The British soldiers we face are not normal troops. They appear from nowhere, strike without warning, and vanish like ghosts. Everything Imperial headquarters told us about British cowardice was lies. What Tanaka witnessed that night would shatter every assumption the Japanese military held about their enemies. A force of just 40 British Commandos had infiltrated his regiment's supply depot, destroyed 3 months of ammunition and food stores, killed 73 soldiers, and disappeared into the jungle before reinforcements arrived. Not a single British body was recovered. This wasn't war as the Japanese understood it. This was something far more terrifying. An enemy who struck from the shadows, who survived in jungles considered impassable, who fought by rules that defied every principle of conventional warfare. If you want to discover how 3,000 British Commandos operating behind enemy lines tied down 50,000 Japanese troops and why Japanese soldiers feared these ghost warriors more than any other Allied force, subscribe now and leave a comment sharing which World War II Special Operations unit you'd like to learn about next.
May 18, 1942. Caledon Valley, Burma. Lieutenant Kenji Yoshida commanded a reinforced company securing supply routes through jungle the British had abandoned during their retreat. His orders were routine: patrol the valley, ensure no enemy activity threatened logistics. Japanese intelligence assured him the nearest British forces were 80 kilometers away, demoralized and fleeing toward India. At 02:30 hours, explosions shattered the night. The ammunition dump erupted in flames. Machine gun fire raked the command post. Grenades detonated among sleeping soldiers. Yoshida's company disintegrated into chaos within seconds. When dawn broke, 47 Japanese soldiers lay dead. The ammunition dump was destroyed. The radio equipment was demolished. 3 officers were dead in their bunks, killed by knives so silently that soldiers sleeping meters away heard nothing. The attackers had vanished completely. No bodies, no blood trails, no evidence except British ammunition casings scattered deliberately at the perimeter, a calling card. Yoshida survived with a knife wound across his ribs, delivered by an enemy he never saw. His report, filed 3 days later from a field hospital, captured the terror Japanese forces would feel throughout the Burma Campaign. The British who attacked were not the soldiers we defeated in February. These were different. They moved through jungle we considered impenetrable. They killed in absolute silence. They knew our positions perfectly. When our reinforcements arrived, we found nothing. They had disappeared as if they never existed. The attackers were 22 men from No. 3 Commando, operating 60 kilometers behind Japanese lines, without supply lines, without support, without any possibility of rescue if things went wrong. They had walked for 6 days through mountains Japanese scouts considered impassable, studied Yoshida's position for 48 hours, struck with devastating precision, and vanished back into terrain where Japanese forces refused to follow. This pattern would repeat across Burma for 3 years, but the Japanese military refused to believe initial reports. Surely British forces, defeated so easily in Malaya and Singapore, could not execute such operations. The reports must be exaggerated, perhaps covering incompetence or cowardice. Then the Chindits arrived. February 8, 1943. Operation Longcloth began. Brigadier Orde Wingate led 3,000 men of the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade deep into Japanese-occupied Burma. They carried supplies for 1 week, then relied on airdrops. Their mission? Destroy Japanese communications and supply lines. prove that Allied forces could operate behind enemy lines indefinitely and create chaos that would tie down Japanese divisions needed elsewhere. Japanese intelligence dismissed the operation as suicide. No force could survive in the jungle without supply lines. The British would starve, contract diseases, or be hunted down within weeks. 3 months later, Japanese commanders were begging Imperial headquarters for reinforcements. The British weren't starving, they were everywhere. Colonel Takeshi Nakamura, responsible for securing 400 kilometers of railroad critical to Japanese operations in Burma, filed increasingly desperate reports throughout March and April 1943. His assessment revealed how thoroughly the Chindits had disrupted Japanese assumptions about warfare. The enemy operates in columns of 300 to 400 men that appear without warning, attack our installations, then disappear before we can respond. They destroyed the Bungyong Gorge Bridge, requiring 3 weeks to repair. They demolished supply dumps at Nankan and Bonchang. They ambushed convoys on the Mandalay Road. They cut telegraph lines daily. Most disturbing, they appeared to be supplied by aircraft. We have observed transport planes dropping supplies in areas 200 kilometers behind our front lines. This should be impossible. The British have no airfields within range. Yet the supplies arrive, and the enemy continues operating. We have committed 2 full regiments to hunting these forces. They engage briefly, then vanish into jungle where our troops cannot follow without getting lost. Our casualties from these engagements now exceed 400 men. We have captured 3 British soldiers, all wounded severely. They refuse to provide information even under extreme interrogation. Request immediate reinforcement. Current strength insufficient to both secure supply lines and hunt enemy columns. The reinforcements never came. Japanese forces throughout Southeast Asia were stretched thin, fighting on multiple fronts. Nakamura's 2 regiments, intended to secure logistics, spent 3 months chasing Chindits through the jungle while supply lines fell apart. When Wingate's force finally withdrew to India in April 1943, they had lost 1,000 men to combat, disease, and exhaustion. Japanese propaganda declared victory. The British invasion had failed. The survivors fled back to India defeated. Japanese military intelligence told a different story. One captured document, a tactical assessment written by General Shinichi Tanaka, revealed the truth senior officers understood. The British Long Range Penetration Force achieved its operational objectives despite heavy losses. They demonstrated that Allied troops can operate behind our lines indefinitely. They tied down forces we needed elsewhere. They destroyed critical infrastructure. Most concerning, their soldiers displayed endurance and jungle warfare skills equal to our finest troops. This contradicts all previous assessments of British fighting capabilities.
The contradiction between Japanese propaganda and reality created confusion throughout imperial forces in Southeast Asia. Private First Class Ichiro Watanabe, transferred to Burma in June 1943 after fighting in China, received the standard briefing about British forces. Cowardly, dependent on superior numbers and equipment, incapable of enduring hardship, prone to surrender when cut off from supply lines. His first patrol encounter with British Commandos destroyed every assumption. July 23, 1943. Watanabe's platoon was ambushing a trail known to be used by British scouts. They had prepared the position carefully, machine gun covering the approach, riflemen concealed in dense vegetation, grenades ready. Textbook tactics that had worked perfectly against Chinese forces. The British never came down the trail. They came from behind. Watanabe was facing the trail when the shooting started. He spun around to see his machine gun crew dead, killed so silently the platoon hadn't heard.
British soldiers emerged from jungle literally meters from Japanese positions. The firefight lasted 90 seconds. When it ended, 16 Japanese soldiers were dead. Watanabe and 2 others survived by playing dead among the bodies. The British checked every corpse methodically, took the machine gun, stripped the bodies of ammunition and equipment, and melted back into the jungle. Watanabe never saw their faces clearly. They wore jungle camouflage that made them nearly invisible. They moved with absolute confidence. They operated in silence that seemed impossible for a military unit. His report to the company commander included a detail that would appear in hundreds of Japanese intelligence assessments. The British soldiers were larger than us, but moved through the jungle more quietly than our scouts. They appeared to know the terrain better than we did. They attacked from a direction we believed impassable. How do you ambush an enemy who comes from behind your ambush? The question had no answer Japanese doctrine provided. Imperial Army tactics emphasized aggression, courage, and willingness to die for objectives. The British Commandos added something Japanese training didn't address. They disappeared when tactical situations turned against them. They refused to fight battles they couldn't win. They struck where Japanese forces were weakest, then vanished before reinforcements arrived. This created a form of warfare that degraded Japanese morale in ways conventional battles never could. Soldiers could accept dying in combat. They couldn't accept being hunted by an enemy they rarely saw and couldn't catch. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka, who survived 3 encounters with British Special Forces, explained the psychological impact in a letter intercepted by British intelligence in November 1943. "We patrol every day hunting the British raiders. We find nothing. Then suddenly they appear, attack our supply convoys or headquarters, kill dozens of our men, and disappear. We search for days and find no trace. At night we hear sounds in the jungle and fear they are watching us. Sleep becomes impossible. Men begin seeing enemies in shadows. This is not combat. This is being prey." The psychological warfare was deliberate. British commandos and Chindits studied Japanese military psychology and exploited every weakness. They knew Japanese forces feared night operations in jungle terrain, so they attacked almost exclusively at night. They knew Japanese communications were vulnerable, so they cut telephone lines and destroyed radio equipment systematically. They knew Japanese logistics depended on predictable supply routes, so they ambushed convoys repeatedly until Japanese forces required full battalion-strength escorts for simple supply runs. Most devastatingly, they knew Japanese military culture viewed isolated soldiers with contempt, so British forces would wound Japanese soldiers deliberately and leave them alive to be rescued, knowing this would tie down combat forces for days evacuating and treating casualties. Lieutenant Saburo Endo, medical officer with the 33rd Division in Burma, documented this tactic in his diary. "The British shoot to wound, not kill. We recover soldiers with leg wounds, abdominal wounds, injuries that require surgery and long recovery. Each wounded man requires 4 men to carry him, medical supplies we don't have, and transport we need for ammunition. The British understand this. They deliberately create casualties that drain our resources. This is warfare calculated to destroy us through attrition rather than battle." The calculation worked. By late 1943, Japanese forces in Burma were struggling not from defeat in conventional battles, but from the cumulative effect of thousands of small actions that degraded their operational effectiveness. Supplies arrived late or not at all. Communications were unreliable. Units pulled from front lines to hunt British raiders depleted defensive strength. Officers spent more time securing logistics than planning operations. Then the second Chindit expedition arrived, and Japanese problems multiplied exponentially. March 1944. Operation Thursday began. 6 Chindit brigades, 20,000 men, infiltrated Japanese-held Burma, this time establishing fortified strongholds supplied entirely by air. Unlike the first expedition's hit-and-run tactics, these forces intended to stay, creating permanent bases deep behind Japanese lines that would serve as anchors for offensive operations. The concept was unprecedented. No army had attempted to maintain divisions behind enemy lines supplied only by aircraft. Japanese intelligence considered it impossible. The British did it anyway.
Stronghold Broadway exemplified everything Japanese military doctrine said couldn't work. Located 240 kilometers behind Japanese front lines, the base housed 9,000 British and Indian troops, 3 artillery batteries, engineering equipment, a field hospital, and an airstrip capable of landing transport planes. All of it supplied entirely by C-47 transports flying nightly from India. Colonel Takeshi Nakamura received orders to eliminate Broadway in March 1944. His regiment of 2,800 men approached the stronghold, expecting to find exhausted British troops barely surviving in jungle conditions, easy prey for a determined attack. Instead, they encountered prepared defenses that would have been formidable even in conventional warfare. Barbed wire perimeters, interlocking fields of fire from machine gun bunkers, pre-registered artillery coordinates for likely Japanese approaches, air support from fighters that appeared within minutes of any attack. Nakamura's first assault on March 27th failed with 140 casualties. The British suffered 12 wounded. His second attempt on April 3rd achieved nothing except 200 more Japanese deaths. The British artillery destroyed his mortar positions before they could fire. British aircraft strafed his assembly areas before attacks could begin. When his troops finally reached the perimeter, machine gun fire from multiple positions created killing zones impossible to cross. After 10 days of attacks, Nakamura withdrew, with his regiment reduced to 1,600 men. Broadway remained operational. His report to divisional command captured the frustration Japanese forces felt throughout the campaign. The enemy stronghold cannot be taken without artillery and air support we don't possess. British troops are well supplied, well armed, and fight from prepared positions. They have communications equipment superior to ours. They receive air support within minutes. We are attacking with infantry alone against an enemy who has every advantage. Request permission to contain rather than assault the position. Permission was denied. Japanese doctrine didn't accept stalemate. Nakamura's regiment was reinforced and ordered to attack again. They failed again. By June 1944, 3 Japanese regiments, over 7,000 men, were committed to operations against Chindit strongholds. Those troops were desperately needed at Imphal and Kohima, where Japanese offensives into India were collapsing. Instead, they were trapped fighting British forces who refused to evacuate, refused to surrender, and couldn't be dislodged without heavy weapons Japanese forces in Burma didn't have. The strategic impact was exactly what Wingate had planned. Relatively small numbers of British troops, positioned behind Japanese lines and supplied by air, tied down Japanese forces many times their size. Every regiment committed against the Chindits was a regiment unavailable for critical operations elsewhere. But the human cost of creating this strategic effect was horrific. Corporal James Mitchell, captured by Japanese forces in May 1944, after his Chindit column was surrounded, later testified about conditions in the strongholds. "We lived on air-dropped rations. We slept in monsoon rain that never stopped. Malaria, dysentery, and infected wounds killed more men than Japanese bullets. We watched friends die from diseases because medical supplies couldn't keep up with casualties. The Japanese attacked constantly. We were under artillery fire daily. Airdrops came at night because daylight flights drew Japanese fighters. Half the supplies landed outside the perimeter where we couldn't recover them. We survived on determination and the knowledge that withdrawal wasn't an option." Mitchell's interrogation report fascinated Japanese intelligence officers because it revealed something they struggled to understand. British troops enduring conditions as bad as Japanese soldiers faced, without the spiritual training Japanese forces received, maintained operational effectiveness through sheer will and unit cohesion. Private First Class Ichiro Watanabe, assigned to hunt Chindit columns after surviving his earlier ambush, wrote detailed observations of British tactics in July 1944. The British moved through jungle in single-file columns, sometimes 400 men stretched across several kilometers. This should make them vulnerable to attack. Instead, they detect our ambushes before walking into them. They have scouts moving parallel to the column who see us before we see the main force. When we attack, they respond immediately with mortars and machine guns while the column scatters into the jungle. Within minutes, they establish defensive positions we cannot overcome. Then aircraft arrive and destroy our positions with bombs and rockets. We inflict few casualties and take heavy losses. Every engagement follows this pattern. The pattern reflected British tactical adaptation to Japanese methods. Early Chindit operations had suffered heavy casualties from Japanese ambushes. By 1944, British forces had learned to expect ambushes everywhere and developed counter-tactics that turned Japanese aggression into a liability. The heavy weapons British columns carried, mortars, heavy machine guns, radio equipment, created firepower advantages that overwhelmed Japanese light infantry tactics. Most critically, British forces had air support Japanese troops couldn't match. Every Chindit column operated with air liaison officers who could call in fighter bombers within 15 minutes. When Japanese forces concentrated for attacks, British aircraft would devastate them before assaults could develop. This capability fundamentally changed jungle warfare dynamics in ways Japanese doctrine couldn't counter.
By August 1944, Japanese forces in Burma faced a crisis unprecedented in their military experience. They were being defeated not through conventional battles, but through systematic attrition that was destroying their ability to conduct operations. British commandos continued hitting supply lines nightly. Chindit strongholds anchored offensive operations that kept Japanese forces constantly reacting. Allied conventional forces were advancing on multiple fronts, pushing Japanese defenses back to Rangoon. And throughout all of this, Japanese soldiers understood they faced an enemy fundamentally different from the British forces they had defeated in 1942. Lieutenant Kenji Yoshida, who survived the initial commando raid in May 1942 and fought throughout the campaign until his capture in March 1945, provided the most comprehensive Japanese assessment of British Special Forces capabilities in post-war interrogation. The British soldiers we faced in 1942 during the Malaya campaign were poorly trained, poorly led, and psychologically unprepared for jungle warfare. We defeated them easily because they fought by European rules in Asian terrain. The Commandos and Chindits were different completely. They were trained specifically for jungle operations. They could survive for months without supply lines. They moved silently and attacked from unexpected directions. They used terrain we considered impassable. Most importantly, they never stopped. We could drive them back, but they would return. We could inflict casualties, but more would arrive. We destroyed their strongholds, and they built new ones. This was the war of attrition we could not win. His assessment identified the critical difference. British Special Forces weren't trying to defeat Japanese armies through conventional battles. They were systematically degrading Japanese operational capability through thousands of small actions that cumulatively made conventional operations impossible. Cut supply lines meant troops went hungry. Destroyed communications meant commanders couldn't coordinate. Constant harassment meant soldiers couldn't rest. The cumulative effect was devastating. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka, captured in January 1945 with advanced malnutrition and untreated wounds, explained the physical toll. By late 1944, we received 1 meal per day, sometimes less. Medical supplies were non-existent. Malaria killed more men than combat. We had ammunition for our rifles, but not enough food to maintain strength to fight. The British seemed to suffer similar conditions but maintained operational effectiveness. We collapsed. This difference decided the campaign. The difference reflected fundamental contrasts in how British and Japanese forces approached jungle warfare.
Japanese military culture emphasized spiritual strength overcoming physical limitations. Soldiers were expected to endure starvation, disease, and wounds through willpower and dedication to the emperor. This worked in short campaigns, but collapsed during extended operations where logistics mattered more than courage. British forces, particularly Commandos and Chindits, combined equal courage with systematic attention to survival. They carried water purification tablets. They understood tropical disease prevention. They rotated units to prevent exhaustion. They evacuated wounded by air rather than abandoning them. The result was forces that maintained effectiveness over extended periods despite harsh conditions. Japanese post-war analysis concluded that British special forces represented the evolution of warfare beyond what imperial military doctrine understood. One assessment written in 1946 by former staff officers captured the institutional failure. We prepared to fight European armies dependent on roads, railways, and conventional supply lines. The British sent forces that needed none of these things. We trained soldiers to endure hardship through spiritual discipline. The British trained soldiers to survive through practical skills and mutual support. We believed our warrior spirit gave us advantages no enemy could match. The British proved that industrial capacity, applied intelligently through special operations, created capabilities beyond what courage alone could achieve. We learned this lesson too late to change the outcome. By 1945, our armies in Burma were defeated not because British soldiers were better warriors, but because British military systems, supply, communications, medical support, and air power were superior to ours in every measurable way. The Commandos and Chindits were symptoms of this systemic superiority, not exceptions to it. This conclusion, reached after Japan's defeat, captured with soldiers like Yoshida, Tanaka, and Watanabe had witnessed firsthand during the campaign. The British special forces they feared weren't supernatural warriors. They were products of military systems that emphasized preparation, logistics, and adaptation over rigid doctrine and spiritual appeals. The 20,000 Chindits who operated in Burma between 1943 and 1945 suffered 30% casualties from all causes. But they tied down over 50,000 Japanese troops who could have decisively influenced battles elsewhere. The hundreds of commando raiders who struck behind Japanese lines for 3 years never numbered more than 3,000 men total. But they destroyed supply infrastructure that starved entire Japanese divisions and created psychological pressure that degraded morale across all units. These relatively small forces achieved strategic effects disproportionate to their numbers because they represented a form of warfare Japanese military doctrine had no answer for. You couldn't defeat an enemy you couldn't find. You couldn't defend supply lines that stretched thousands of kilometers through jungle terrain. You couldn't maintain morale when soldiers faced an enemy who struck from darkness and vanished before you could respond. The Japanese soldiers who fought British special forces learned these lessons through the cruelest teacher, direct experience. Their testimonies, captured in diaries, interrogation reports, and post-war interviews, reveal forces that earned respect through demonstrated capabilities rather than propaganda or reputation. The Burma Campaign proved that modern warfare rewarded adaptation, logistics, and systematic application of combined capabilities over courage and spiritual commitment alone. This lesson, written in the deaths of over 185,000 Japanese soldiers in Burma, came too late to change Japan's fate, but shaped military special operations doctrine for decades to come.